And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to the monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, and most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Mildra, and with me I have a returning good brother to the temple. Previously here for 2 of his past compendiums, and now coming back for the three-peat, I suppose, with the Compendium of Airships and Artifacts. The one and only KibblesTasty. How you doing today, man?
Pretty good. Thank you for having me on again. I am happy to share another book.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this will be the 3rd time I've had you on. I believe the last time was focused on crafting, and this time around the big focus is airships, along with a few other things that we'll get to.
And crafting again.
Oh yeah, because if after 10+ years the people writing the core books aren't going to do crafting, it falls on the third party to do it.
Well, this new book is called, Kibbles Compendium of Airships and Artifacts, and both those are things that I need to give the players ways to make. So, because, you don't always just find the perfect one laying around, so they require some customization.
Oh yeah. But before we get to that, I'd like to delve into the 2 new classes that we're bringing in. The first is the Paragon. So, what can you tell me about the playstyle of the Paragon and what separates it from, say similar martial characters? I know a lot of people are probably going to bring up Monk in comparison.
So Paragon is a pretty interesting one, and it's one that I'm really happy to share with people, but I think it's kind of difficult to convey the selling point by the name of it, just because a class name, is a pretty broad bucket. What I call it is I call it an active martial class. So this is going to be easier to describe to the people that got the last book, because in the last book I had something called active martial feats, which were a new type of feat that were designed for martial characters. They're feats, anyone can take them. But the idea of them was that they gave you a special active ability. So, for example, they often replaced underperforming player handbook feats, where they'd be like, a feat that gave you like Charger would give you a special active ability, which replaces an attack as part of your attack action. And that would let you actually charge, like run 30 feet forward and do damage to someone you collide with, that kind of thing. So that was in the last book, and that was called Active Martial Feats. And that system worked really well. There were ways to take more active abilities, these kind of like concrete, not really spells, but like akin to a physical spell, into their character. But what Paragon does is it kind of goes all in on that idea. So Paragon does overlap a little bit with Fighter, Barbarian, and Monk, but it's kind of along a different axis than those classes, where on every turn, instead of attacking multiple times with basic attacks, you'll choose to do one of a set of active abilities. And the most common iconic ones of these are like Whirlwind or Charge or Break, which is like when you're grappling someone, you can try to inflict a crippling wound against them. So basically, the difference between this and the active martial feats is that you can do one of these every turn, at least starting at 5th level. And they basically have a resource system called exertion, but you renew your exertion every turn starting at 5th level. So then in each turn you basically perform a special maneuver. And this is going to be kind of similar to Powers of 4E, 4th edition. That's going to be what a lot of people think of, and that's not entirely by accident, right? That's one of the things that I'm drawing on. It's trying to give people, I don't want to take away the existing martial classes, but there's a lot of demand within people playing martial classes that want to have a dynamic roster of more abilities that directly engage with the mechanics. So this lets them give like a whole big roster of special abilities. And so a Paragon actually kind of has two subclasses. One is your origin, which is kind of the theme of a Paragon, right? Is that you break past your basic mortal limits, right? You're stronger, you can do stuff that other humans can't. So your origin kind of explains why that is. And then, one of those origins is just called Prodigy, which just means you don't really have an origin, you just work harder, get more results from it, that kind of thing. But other ones cover things like being a divine descendant, kind of like playing into the mythological demigod kind of thing, the Greek hero kind of thing. Others are psionic abilities, stuff like that. But then the second half of that is what's called your pursuits, which are your pursuits of perfection, like what you try to be super good at. So like the most iconic ones are pursuit of strength, pursuit of endurance, pursuit of speed. And it's like pursuit of strength is where you'll find things like Whirlwind and meteor jump, which lets you jump super far and come down on people. That's where you'll find that ability to try to snap people in half when you're grappling them. Stuff like that. So the Paragon, it fills a similar role to a fighter, but it approaches that role in a different way. It's not really a spellcaster, right? Because it doesn't have spell slots, doesn't have that kind of resource system. But it's like a half step between them in complexity, though it's thematically much closer to a martial. And exertion does work in a ballpark like a monk's key or focus, but the idea with key is that you spend it to, be more powerful, and then you kind of are rationing it out across the fight, where you're on a gradient, and eventually you run out of ki, and you're just punching, and you're still decently
Mm-hmm.
effective punching, right? The idea of a martial is you have this higher baseline, but with Paragon, you still have some of that gradient where you have exertion when you're spending your maximum exertion. You're doing multiple abilities, special abilities on a turn. But even once you run completely out of exertion, you still have one of these abilities every turn.
Mm-hmm.
So you won't be having extra attack, at least not until high levels. But in place of that, you get to do a special attack each turn.
Mm-hmm. Which
And go ahead.
I can certainly get that, and it does sound like Paragon isn't necessarily built on a dwindling resource so much as it is what's the right tool for the moment.
Right. It's trying to fit the martial curve of the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with a spellcaster, right, you're going from high resource to low resource, from long rest to end of day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Marshals are spikier, they have a higher baseline, but they're spikier with short rest. So Paragon still gets benefits from short rest, still has that never fully runs out of resources, never really goes dry kind of philosophy, but it allows you to have something you can do different on each of your turns, because your minimum roster of these abilities, right? You have at least 4 or 5 of these as you approach early game, and more as you get into the late game. Um, but a lot of times you'll be picking from a few standard ones.
Mm-hmm.
Your charge, your whirlwind, your heavy attack kind of things. You'll have a few ones, but they focus a lot more on AoE conditions, movement, stuff like that, compared to raw damage. Because they're not better than a fighter, right? I'm not trying to move the power level up significantly. But what I want to do is I want to kind of change the interaction with the game. So, you're not going to compete in the raw damage of a sharpshooter, crossbow expert, fighter that's, shooting off 12 crossbow bolts in turn or something. But you will have choices on each of your turns, to engage with in a bunch of different ways. And people have really been having a lot of fun with Paragon. Like,
Mm-hmm.
of my playtesters, several of them have been more enthusiastic about it than any class I've made before, just because, like, you just get to do a lot of cool stuff. You just leap into the middle of enemies and start whirlwinding and cleaving and stuff. And one of your buddies lets you throw enemies and stuff. It kind of eases up on the kind of mundane expectations of a mortal martial character, right? Your classic fighter tries not to exceed the human baseline much, but because Paragon is drawing more from that mythological kind of hero, you can just pick up another person and chuck them 20 feet. Um, that's kind of the things you're expected to be able to do, because you're not necessarily a human, you're kind of a superhuman.
Mm-hmm.
Though, mechanically you're not doing more damage, but you're engaging with the world in a more dramatic way.
Mm-hmm. I
And
can.
that's not going to be what everyone wants from a martial, right? So this is why it's a new class, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's going to be people that want to have, say, me have axe, me smash, and they play a barbarian, and that's great. I have players that will not prefer Paragon to barbarian, but I also have a lot more players that would prefer Paragon to barbarian, because they want to, take their axe and do special stuff with it.
Yeah. Just it is amusing to me, especially given some of the narratives that have been inflicted upon um, martial characters over the years. Um,
Right.
especially
Well,
the.
I think there's this big tension, I think, of how supernatural a martial is, right? Some people want them to be able to cleave a castle wall with their sword in one blow, and some people want them to be a quasi-historical knight. And that tension is difficult to resolve, right? Because those are both vaguely plausible within the fantasy genre. Speaking to different kind of legacies within it. But that's why I think that Paragon is called what it is and is what it is, because it's drawing from a less kind of medieval knight archetype and more from a mythological kind of larger than life archetype.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. And on the other hand, there's Summoner, which you do describe as a minion controller, and something I'd be curious about is a lot of times with controlling minions, there's the temptation to make a almost a micro character sheet version of whatever you're trying to summon. Um, what sort of approach are you taking with Summoner? Is it gonna be is it a case where they are controlling a small army onto themselves, or are they controlling just one very strong companion? What approach are you taking?
So Summoner is Paragon was an interesting challenge in its own way, but it's mostly charting new territory and trying to define, how it can work. Summoner is kind of a different problem where I think most people have a grasp on what Summoner is mechanically or just thematically, but it's trying to fit that into something that works in 5th edition that's a challenge. And it's one of those things that I had taken stabs at previously several times over the years. Been writing classes for 8 years now, and it comes up relatively frequently.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a list of kind of requirements for the summoner of what I wanted to see before I would say I could call it a class that's ready for production. And right, one of those things was I wanted to make sure that a summoner can have more than one summon. It wasn't just an ascended pet class.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is a subclass of summoner that is basically a pet class where you have one powerful summon and you just get to customize it and you get to, build it out and stuff like that. But, to me, like that was the easy route, but it wasn't what I felt like a lot of people wanted from summoner. They really wanted to have multiple summons. And that's very challenging because anyone that has played, classic 5e with conjure animals knows that that spell is probably not a good idea. You're probably not going to have a good time if someone is using that spell because it just grinds the game to a halt where suddenly one person is controlling, 8 different flying hawks or whatever.
Yeah.
But with Summoner, what I really want to do is I wanted to find a way to approach it in different ways and then streamline all of those approaches so that they were manageable within, a reasonable 5th edition turn. So it's probably going to be on the more complex end compared to a martial, but I think it's probably going to be less than, some spellcasters in terms of turn complexity. But basically, here's how it works. So again, it has kind of 2 subclasses,
Mm-hmm.
where the first, where the temptation is to make your what you summon a subclass, right? So if you summon devils, you would summon angels. If you summon beasts, summon elementals. So that could have been the subclass. But what I want to do is I wanted to be your method of summoning be the subclass. So the first subclass is the Legion Caller. And that's the one that has kind of like a squad of minions. So you don't have a crazy number, but you have, 1, 2, 3, 4 as you level up minions. And the way it handles it is that your minions move right after you, but they have a very simple and streamlined kind of, almost script-like a way to move or, take their turn.
Mm-hmm.
And that they can either move or attack, but they cannot do both. And then the summoner is the one. So usually the summoner is going to either summon or move them with its action, and then the summons will just attack. So you end up with kind of like a quasi-martial kind of turn where but you're just kind of position them around as the summoner's turn. You're playing like this warlord, the squad captain.
Mm-hmm.
You just move them, and then they just all attack at once.
In that
And
regard, would they be akin to controlling minions in an RTS?
well, similar, right? You're playing like a mini squad commander as a Legion Caller. And that they do have hit points, but usually going to have a very small hit point pool. Somebody's not even going to live through a single hit. They're going to be kind of disposable cardboard minions frequently.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of one approach, and a lot of things are done with that to kind of make it manageable, keep the number of minions in control, but also make it so that their turns are pretty straightforward. They all have stat blocks that are presented with the class, but those stat blocks are not the monster manual stat blocks. They're kind of simplified, streamlined kind of stat blocks made for this kind of summoner-based gameplay. And then there's the contractor. That's kind of the pet class. They have only a single summon, but it's bigger, beefier, and much more customizable. And then there's the swarm controller, right? So that's for the one that people want a bunch of minions. They just want an endless horde of minions. But the way that one works is that your swarm takes one of two forms. Either it becomes an aura around you, where your swarm is not directly attacked, but it basically gives you damage resistance, but half the damage you take goes to the swarm.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a unit on the field, but it has an impact on the field. Like you can make it, create difficult terrain, you can make it do damage, all these kind of different things. Or you can deploy your swarm like a swarm of rats or bats or something in D&D, and then you move it around as a big swarm, and it has special swarm actions. Like it can do a storm of attacks where rolls a bunch of does a bunch of damage. Like if your swarm is big enough, it automatically hits just because like this overwhelming number of attacks, and it just kind of treats it as an average of damage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want to control 12 different minions, so you just kind of condense that into this swarm stat block. And then there's weirder options as you keep going, and that's kind of the benefit of being a class.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the Invoker, where they overcharge their minions, so they summon a minion and it probably explodes at the end of their turn. That's kind of like they summon like unstable planar powers that then they send out, it attacks once, and then either you detonated it or when it dies it detonates. And those are the Invokers, the kind of the nuker wildcard one.
Yeah.
And then the most recent one is one the patrons just voted on, which is the World Sculptor. And they summon extra planar terrain. So like they can summon pillars of fire and lava from the plane of fire, or stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get these increasingly abstract ideas all built around the core. And that's what made it as a class to me. That was what made it kind of click as, this is a big enough category, not to just be the pet class, but to be all these different incarnations of summoning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could certainly see that.
The latest plane of study, and the plane of study is basically your second subclass where you pull stuff from. So there's all the classics of, infernal, abyssal, celestial, elemental. But the latest one that people just voted on was the Iron Grave, which is kind of like where weapons go to die, I guess. And it's filled with, rusty animated swords and decrepit siege engines and, creaky war golems and stuff like that. So it's, not necessarily the brass clockwork kind of construction. It's kind of like, the rusty engines of war and spirit of conflict. And the inspiration for that kind of like Acheron, the metal cube plane.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if I'm saying the name of that plane right. Haven't said that in a while. But that's not part of the SRD, so it's kind of like a spin on that kind of plane of just like this iron war and blood and rust and conflict plane. And so what they summon, right, is they summon animated weapons and animated armor and siege engines that are fire themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that's what I like about a class, is when it can have a huge number of stuff that fits into it.
Oh yeah, and also making sure that it isn't overwrought when it comes to the amount of stat blocks for them. So you don't have a summoner type character who has the largest character sheet possible to account for all of these summon stat blocks they have at their disposal.
Right. So, one of the things that I knew couldn't be done when I started the summon is I cannot just say open the monster manual and pick a monster. Like, that's obviously what some people are going to want. but that leads to so many edge cases and problems that for a wide variety of reasons. Because then you have a class that scales in power with each new book that has monsters in it. You have all these considerations that a monster designer wasn't having when a player can summon it, stuff like that. So the way that this works is that each plane of study comes with 3 standard monsters and then a 4th that you can select as an esoteric secret. And then you get a maximum of 2 planes of study. So you have, between 4 and 8 monsters you can summon. And, that increases as you level. And, 8 monsters might sound like a lot until you realize that, a wizard has 40 or some odd spells, and a spell block is often just as long as these pretty streamlined monster blocks, right? Because these are really distilled down to what does the summon care about. So they'll each have, a few unique traits that make them distinct from other summons, but they're all very streamlined kind of, formula-based blocks that kind of draw a lot on your stats as a summoner. They don't really ascend in power as you level because they scale with your character. So the higher level ones aren't necessarily stronger, but they sometimes have, more dramatic abilities, like the ability to fly, more damage resistances, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Although, I suppose it's only a matter of time before someone does a build with Summoner to basically be a legally distinct Zerg Rush.
Yeah, so I mean, there is already the Beyond plane and the Void plane. Neither of them are really Zerg, but I've noticed a tendency for players to vote for any sort of aberration or horror they can come up with. So I'm sure if that is up for vote on a plane of study, that might be, some sort of bio-alien nightmare would not be impossible.
Oh yeah. Now, in addition to that, there's a bunch of other subclasses that are going to be in this book. Some of them for the core classes, and some of them for classes that we've talked about in previous iterations of this. So, obviously, going into all of them would be would be a bit overkill. So, what I'd like to do instead is I will list off one of the existing classes, and you can tell me one of the subclasses you have planned for that.
Sure.
So, let's go. Since it is me, and since I have to work my gimmick, let's go with Monk.
Okay, so I actually have 3 subclasses for Monk in the book. Well, 3 so far. One is the Way of the Closed Fist, one is the Way of the Demon, and the last one is Way of Time. So the Closed Fist is kind of an interesting story because it started as the Way of 100 Fists, and it was all about like rapidly punching things. And as soon as I wrote that, people were like, well, what if I want to do some other kind of thing? So it kind of became this mirror to the Way of Open Hand, right? So there's the Open Hand Monk. So then I thought the name, if you wanted a monk that was all about different ways of punching, it would be the Way of the Closed
Also
Fist.
makes for a good Jade Empire reference.
And it kind of draws in the same pool of thought that Paragon does in a way, actually, and that it gets a bunch of different fist techniques. It's kind of like a monk battle master, but all of the maneuvers are different ways to punch people. So it gets, skyward slam and shockwave punch and 100 fist strike and stuff like that. So it's all these different kind of special punching things that it can do spending ki. Way of the Demon is kind of an interesting one because I feel like I don't know if you're familiar with Street Fighter and Akuma, but I feel like
yes, I am.
When people were voting for it, that's basically what they were voting for. And I won't say that it is that, but I will say that I feel like there was a certain influence of that idea. And the theme of it basically is just it's a monk in the fact, but it kind of twists their ki into something more demonic. It gets demon burst, demon punch, demon flare, and then it can create ethereal arms that punch more. And yet some of its abilities, I think its ultimate is actually named after Its ultimate is called Ultimate Rage. And that's where it just punches a whole bunch of times. That's a bunch of key points. And then the Way of Time is kind of a simpler one in the fact that it kind of steps back. It's more classical monk, and that it doesn't give you a bunch of. It's not a pile of fancy abilities so much. It just gives you a ways of manipulating the flow of time around you, which is a very kind of monk-like thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're already catching arrows out of the air and stuff like that. What it kind of themes is around like you store time, and then you can basically you can save up some of your movement by moving slower,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can unleash that by moving accelerating your time and moving faster and attacking more and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of treats time as like an elastic resource. Um, yeah, those are the three monk classes currently planned for it, or
All right.
subclasses.
So, I suppose another one to delve into, since I have referred to this as the most cursed class, Ranger.
Right. So Ranger, I think it has two. Well, it has one for now, but I think it has another one in production. But the one that it has right now is an interesting one. It's called Were Stalker, and its kind of theme is it's kind of like I guess werewolf, were tagger, were rat, were bat kind of class or subclass idea, where I think it's kind of drawing on that. The druid is a transforming class, and the ranger,
Mm-hmm.
among its many incarnations of things, right, is that it kind of has that half druid theme. And so this is kind of infusing the idea of a transformer, shifter transformation were class with a martial. So you basically get this hybrid transformation where you can kind of grow claws, tusks, pure were boar. Basically you pick one of these, bloodlines to have of transformation, and then you can activate that to get special abilities.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of one of the things it does is, rangers are, a lot of ranger subclasses tend to assume you're at range with a bow. And this can, right? Because if you want to be like a werebat or something, that can be a very effective tactic. But a lot of the abilities are more focused on making a ranger a more viable melee combatant, because when you transform, you get a bit more damage reduction because, a werewolf is not good at taking damage. You
Mm-hmm.
don't get the full immunity, obviously, to non-magic weapons, but you get some degree of damage reduction.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you level, you get more and more kind of these wild surge, bestial kind of abilities, wild frenzy, and then enhanced senses from your partial beast nature, kind of stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. And one final one I'll go into to give some attention to the casting classes. Oh, what would you have in mind for um, warlocks?
So warlocks, let me see. They have, I think they have three, but I have two of them here. So the two warlocks here. Do, do, do. Okay, so the two warlocks currently locked in, and there's a third one, but I don't think it's locked in yet. So the two locked in ones are the Archmage, which is kind of an arcane power source warlock. Some sort of high magical entity. It could be anything from a lich to a archwizard to, an ancient, or even, magical demigod kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives you a bunch of arcane resources. It's kind of like the, failed wizard apprentice in some ways, in that, you get these pseudo wizard abilities, like you can make a wizard spell book out of scrolls, but they're, scrolls that you just don't expend when you cast. It's not a real wizard kind of book. But
Mm-hmm.
their kind of main gimmick is that they get a pool of arcane reservoir are basically arcane missiles, right? That when they cast other spells, they can release these as a bonus action. And if you're familiar with the Celestial Warlock, it's kind of like the inverse of that, where that gets a pool of healing dice.
Mm-hmm.
These get a pool of arcane missile dice. So you can cast arcane missiles, or arcane magic missile, and then
Mm-hmm.
release arcane missiles to release even more magic missiles, or you can cast them alongside normal warlock stuff like Eldritch Blast or your other spells.
Mm-hmm.
And they get a pretty potent list of bonus spells because there's a lot of spells that a warlock is normally denied that are fancy wizard exclusive spells, and this lets them nab some of those. Obviously, you
Mm-hmm.
can't let them have everything. Um, the other one is a bit more cosmic in nature, and it's called the inevitable, which is kind of most people will be familiar with what those are. They're kind of the enforcement mechanism of the planes.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a warlock that is contrary to the nature of many warlocks I've encountered over the years. An agent of cosmic order. And so they get, stuff like enforced edict and controlled causality
Mm-hmm.
that allow them to kind of reduce the chaos of a battlefield and attempt to control the actions of, chaotic forces. They get, buffs to stuff like command. They get, karmic reflections, stuff like that. They can kind of try to negate advantage and disadvantage. And then, at high levels, they get inevitable judgment, which is for when they cross the line and you issue an edict against them that is a very extremely powerful debuff that is very hard to overcome because,
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of the forces of reality trying to unmake you. One of their eldritch evocations is a book of transgressions, where this is kind of one of those kind of plot tied things where when you keep discovering crimes against your, inevitable purpose, you can record those into a book that allows you to get certain buffs against a character as you get more evidence
Mm-hmm.
gathered against them for their planar crimes.
Oh yeah. Uh, for whatever reason, I'm reminded of the way the Witch Hunter worked in Warhammer Online, where you were building up these judgments against someone, as in the same vein of if I'm bringing up Warhammer, I it would be remiss if I did not bring up the Book of Grudges that every dwarf clan has.
Yeah,
You know,
it's a similar kind of idea, and this is not a core feature of the class because it's one of those things that would be hard to use in some cases, right? Depending on your campaign, you might not have, because if you just have a random encounter against wolves, this is not doing anything.
mm-hmm.
But it's one of those. That's why it makes a good evocation because it's something you can bolt onto the class that gives a lot of flavor and potential. But obviously, will only work in some cases. But yeah, it's definitely one of those building a grudge, building a case, kind of setting up this villain to
Mm-hmm.
have increasing, abilities against them.
Oh yeah, and I could I could most definitely see it. Uh, and that brings us to the big ol' elephant in the room that has decided to break into my monastery and take a crash on my couch. So let's talk about airships. Uh,
Right. So, the way that I make a book, right, is that over the years, I make a bunch of classes and subclasses and stuff like that. And that's, what makes up the Patreon content I make on a monthly basis. So I know going into a book that I have a bunch of that stuff to make or to publish, right? And then I decide, what cool things do I want to bundle this with? And in this case, the two things that were decided on were airships and artifacts. And so airships I picked kind of because I think it makes a good Kickstarter book thing. Because to run a game with airships, there's a lot of stuff you might want. So one of the things it brings is like battle maps that are for airships. It has modular battle maps for player airships.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there will be limited amounts that you can kind of customize what you want. If you have the digital version, right, you get an asset pack of airship parts. And then there's enemy maps that are more dynamic and have fancier lighting and encounter design that are made for boarding enemy airships. But that's kind of why I think it's a Kickstarter thing. But as for the airships themselves, right, it's not something you want every campaign, but it's something that's cool to kind of flavor up a game with, right? If you ever give the players a chance to get an airship, they're probably going to be into it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the challenges of campaigns is often there's not great ways to spend gold. And airships are another great kind of gold sink, right? Because you can give these players something they really want to kind of build up and invest into. So your airship comes in several stages, right? You can find one, you can build one, but once you have it, right, that's kind of the starting gun. That's then you upgrade it, you can install new weapons, find elemental drives, glue more wings onto it, all sorts of nonsense. But there's also kind of that plays into an airship system, right? Because you want rules for engaging with other airships, which the book has. And one of the important things about that, right, is I want all of the characters on an airship to have active roles. So it has, airship roles that are separate from your class, because I don't want the barbarians to be staring at the enemy airship until they get into boarding range, right? I want them to have special airship actions they can be doing in that, in that flying phase.
Yep.
So you can fling a fireball at an enemy airship, and that'll probably be effective. But I want the airship phase to, primarily focus on airship weapons and airship actions until you decide if you want to board them or not. Because if you blast them out of the sky, you don't get their stuff. And if we know anything about players, they want the enemy's stuff. So a lot of airships are still going to end in boarding action, stuff like that. But there's kind of an aerial phase that it might be the whole combat sometimes. And I wanted to make that, not too complicated, but also more complicated than, just doing an event roll with a modifier.
Mm-hmm.
So it is kind of like a new version of vehicle combat, but vehicle combat in 5e is underbaked itself.
Oh, yeah.
So it's, this whole thing on top of that.
Yeah. And
rules for kind of maneuvering your airship, and also what happens if your airship is heavily damaged. Because you don't want just like if the airship is reduced to 0 hit points and is 1,000 feet up in the air, everyone would die if there's no crashing rules. Like you have to have rules for controlled landings, uncontrolled landings. How bad it is when your airship breaks in two.
But I am curious if you are going to be having different size categories of airship, because there's always been the modest size one that's meant to house an adventuring party, but we see so often the fantasy of larger airships that could be whole bases or small cities unto themselves. Your equivalent of like the shield helicarrier or something like that, minus the crashing. Because that thing crashes so often, it may as well be charged with insurance fraud.
So there is 3 or 4 categories of airship. I'm still hammering out the last potential category, but the first category is kind of like the sloop, the kind of like the rowboat style airships where you can pack a party onto them, but they're not exactly a comfortable luxury liner. These are cheap, usually relatively maneuverable and fast. But they're kind of like a 1 or 2 room, the studio apartment of airships.
Probably get abused by pirates because they're cheap.
Right, and they're cheap. They if you send them crashing into something, you probably can buy a new one, etc. And they might be good at outrunning eldritch space whales, whatever. But they're not, they're kind of like a wagon scale, I guess. They're wagon scale. Up from there, right, you get An airship that is comfortably crewed by the party, but probably doesn't have a bunch of guest spots on it. And that's like, the riverboat kind of airship. Um, they're probably not as maneuverable. They're probably a lot more expensive. But this is where you might actually have, crew quarters and fancy stuff like that. You start having rooms you can customize in the below decks of the airship. You can install some serious weapons on the thing. And that's like the first step where it can reasonably serve as a player base of operations, but it's still pretty cramped. You're not making research laboratories on that.
Yeah. Would you
And
say
then you
this would be
have
the
like
equivalent of, say, the Serenity or the Bebop?
probably on the smaller end of those, at least for the Serenity, but those are like on the, I guess we'll call them yacht class, airships for the purpose of here, right? They can comfortably fit a group of adventurers. They might get their own rooms, but they're not, they don't have a full auxiliary crew.
Mm-hmm.
And then, the next step up would be a sailing ship, like, a flying boat kind of airship. And these ones, there's probably an auxiliary crew helping.
Mm-hmm.
It probably has a deck of cannons. These are the ones where you can, like, carry serious cargo, and stuff like that. Um, and this is one where, the players are probably not flying it alone anymore. Now they probably have a bit of a crew to manage. And this is kind of like a long-term base. It's bigger than, it's bigger than a player. It's like a small flying fort.
Mm-hmm.
And the last category, I guess, would be really the more flying fort, where it'd be not quite a flying island, but it'd be, the big kind of lumbering base kind of airship.
A Dreadnought.
And I don't know if that one will be exposed to the players as a fully, customizable thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm still kind of working on that because, like, that doesn't really fit on a battle map super well anymore. That would be like 4 battle maps,
Mm-hmm.
So that is probably going to be a size category that's available, but it might have, less of the, support in terms of battle maps and stuff for it.
Yeah, I could certainly see that. And given that kind of size, there's
like in each category there's at least like 3 models for the smaller ones.
Mm-hmm.
And then for each of those models, right, there's upgrades you can apply to them, right? So a small one, the simplest small one might just have, wings and sails and stuff, but then you upgrade it with an elemental engine and suddenly it goes much faster and it can maneuver much better, and you can power, more magical weapons with it, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, when it comes to airship combat, is this something that would work exactly the same as regular combat, or is there going to be a degree of abstraction? And I'm not talking. I'm talking ship to ship combat when it comes to this kind of thing.
Right. So it takes place on a grid, but the grid is optional, though I recommend a grid. Well, yeah, I sort of recommend a hex grid, but that's a conversation for a different day. But it is on a different scale than normal player combat because airships move faster and always move. So you kind of zoom out for the airship combat, but it's not exactly like player combat because the players only have 1 airship typically. So it goes much faster, but it's like, it's kind of like 2 legendary monsters fighting because each airship has multiple actions based on what the crew on the airship is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's similar to similar to D&D combat, but it's kind of streamlined, and then it will frequently dovetail into D&D combat if the airships get too close and people start engaging with, boarding the enemy airship.
Yeah. But it does sound like based on what you mentioned earlier with the Barbarian, it sounds like there are certain crew actions that are taken at that scale.
Right. So basically, it's still player initiative, but basically the airships move at their initiative, which will be what the pilot's initiative probably is. And then the players that are on the airship are each taking special actions. And then the enemy airship is doing the same thing, and there will often be multiple enemy airships. or at least sometimes you can pull Phoenician. And of course, you can also just engage flying monsters because, infamously, fantasy skies have dragons in them. So it has to be able to interact with actual D&D monsters sometimes because a dragon is, an airship scale monster.
Yep. Which would certainly make sense. Oh, and I am curious if because of that there are going to be certain weapons that are added in to fill in the gunnery role on a ship.
Right. Airships have their own whole category of airship weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the and there's some unique rules for airships and how they can be damaged because like shooting an arrow at an airship probably does no damage to it. They have what's called a damage threshold of, you have to do X amount of damage to actually impact them. But for any airship scale monster like a dragon, they're considered to be, like siege monsters, so they can break through that.
Mm-hmm.
And then yeah, there's a whole bunch of weapons that range from, classic fantasy weapons like, a ballista or something.
Mm-hmm.
We have basic siege weapons like that. Then there's somewhat, steamy punk weapons, which are kind of more like cannons. And then there's a whole bunch of, more fantasy weapons like, elemental
Yep.
weapons but those need to be powered by having some sort of arcane engine or magical elemental engine on your ship.
Mm-hmm. And I did see that you have a rotary Daka because everyone is not immune to the siren call of automatic fire.
Yeah, so I have separated out all firearms to kind of a scale of tech level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if your world doesn't have firearms, if you're playing either in low, simpler era fantasy or in, Eberron kind of fantasy, firearms are their own category, which may or may not exist in your setting.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a whole selection of, cannons to Gatling guns, all sorts of stuff that are, somewhat anachronistic for a D&D setting, but I find that when you get to ships, people expect various types of cannons. And then to take that kind of one step further, one of the stretch goals that was funded what was called chrono-shifted airship threats, which are based on monsters I wrote from the previous book. In the previous book, I had what were called, super advanced golems, but the joke was that they were robots, basically. So now those are going to make an appearance in this as well. But again, those will be categoried out, and those will just be basically sci-fi weapons. It will be super powerful, high rarity kind of weapons.
Mm-hmm.
But again, they're their own categories. So if you don't want to use those, you don't. They're not assumed. But and to get those, you have to go shoot down one of these super powerful, chrono shifted airships. So
Yeah. How far sci-fi are we going? Are we talking black hole guns or something like that?
So one of the other games I play is Lancer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Lancer,
Oh, I'm
but
familiar with Lancer.
that's a super sci-fi setting. So I would say, generally speaking, not we're talking more like plasma turrets and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
not the full-on reality warping weapons. But in D&D, we have magic, so the mechanics of magic and the mechanics of advanced sci-fi can be, somewhat warped. Like I have a spell that creates a black hole, so why not a, black hole cannon? So a black hole cannon is pretty reasonable by my standards. We have to accept that a D&D black hole is probably not quite a real black hole.
Mm-hmm. No
Since
sense.
it just does a number of dice damage and destroys stuff that they reduce to 0 hit points, but it doesn't one shot a dragon.
Oh yeah.
Probably might
Mm-hmm.
one shot a young dragon.
No, and I remember one of my players once saying, "Anything worth shooting is worth shooting twice."
Well, airships provide a lot of the heavy armory needs of a player.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it really goes the whole scale, right? You can restrict things to being pretty simple airships that are just sails and hot air balloons and ballistas. And that's kind of the basic level of airships
Hmm.
that's kind of the buy-in, right? If you have airships, you probably have something like that, right? Those might not be realistic for a medieval fantasy setting per se, but those are kind of the default assumption of airships.
Yep.
And then from there, you go to the more magical heavy ones, the Everon era, the kind of more Final Fantasy airships. And then you keep going up until you get to like the steampunk kind of airships that have more advanced armaments and powered by dubious science gadgets. And then you go all the way to the sci-fi airships that are sufficiently advanced technologies that it's equal to magic kind of airships.
Yeah. And a lot of people end up forgetting the other half of that passage when it comes to Clark's law. Any sufficiently researched technology any sufficiently researched magic is indistinguishable from technology.
Well, that's kind of where I think it's a whole genre of fantasy these days. But um, so it's again, it's not a system that I think all games are going to use, right? I would say even in my games, probably less than a fifth of them use airships. But it's nice to have as a way to extend a game or to put a twist into a game. Because sometimes the adventure is about slogging through the forest fighting wolves, and sometimes you just don't want to do that, and you'd rather engage with higher fantasy kind of stuff.
Hmm. Yep. But it's one of those things where it's best to have a wide variety.
Yeah, I mean, because you don't need three airship books, so it's one airship
No,
book that covers everything.
no. Although I'm pretty sure someone's going to use this to go nuts when it comes to making airships. And speaking of making, that brings me to um the par- the modular crafting system you have that is going to include artifacts.
Right. So as you bring up, the artifact half of this is kind of the ultimate extension of modular crafting. So to explain modular crafting, I've kind of stepped back into say what non-modular crafting is, because I've already made a crafting system and it was pretty well received. It was pretty popular. And that, I call it the Kibbles crafting system. And what that one does is it takes all the items in the DMG and, a bunch of other items. And then there's expansions like Griffin Saddlebag items and stuff. So it takes all these existing magic items and gives you a recipe of how to make them. And it uses essences and reagents and components and stuff. So it has these semi-standardized kind of ingredients so that you can reasonably harvest a good selection of things from different monsters, right? So if you kill a dragon, right, you might harvest its heart or something, but that heart becomes a rare primal essence, right? So then that rare primal essence can be used in a bunch of different recipes. And that system works great if you want to make items from the DMG, right? Or magic items in D&D. If you want to make a magic item from scratch into an existing magical item. But one of the there's two tensions with that system. One is that if you give a mouse a cookie, if you let players craft, they want to go beyond. They want to make their own stuff. They want to break fresh. They want to go where no player has gone before, and they want to make a staff of bonking that also does this other thing. So what modular crafting does is it works like crafting or it makes magic items more like, I don't know if you're familiar with the magic items of Diablo or Path of
Right?
Exile,
I
where
am.
they have a prefix and a suffix. So modular crafting lets you make it basically gives you a huge list of prefixes and a huge list of suffixes. It calls modifiers, and you can have one of each, right? So you can make a vicious weapon of fire or a vicious longsword of fire, and so that weapon would crit on a bigger range and do fire damage on hit. But it can also do, you can put spells in the weapon, so it has charges that you can expend to cast a list of different spells. And so there's a huge list of modifiers, and you can basically mix and match those modifiers across different item types, which results, in thousands of potential permutations, obviously. But they're kind of, more standardized, more kind of limited things. And so there's two kind of benefits of this. One is it allows you to make custom magic items that don't already exist, and it might fit your character better than, a pre-existing magic item, though they're a bit, more standardized than some magic items you might find in the DMG. And the other thing it does is, a lot of players want to upgrade their starting equipment, stuff like that, instead of just replace it with new items. So if you have, a sword that was handed down from your, 6 generations of knights in your family, you don't want to just throw it out and you get a +1 sword. Mm-hmm. So this lets you make that a +1, sword of knightliness that makes you immune to frightened or something. And then you can replace those modifiers with better modifiers when you can later. Mm-hmm. But you can't keep stacking modifiers. You can only have one prefix and one suffix, and you can replace those, but you can't stack those. Yeah. But that's where an artifact comes in. An artifact works somewhat differently, right? You can only have one artifact per character, but it lets you keep stacking more modifiers onto the item. But
would it be fair to say, if you're making the Diablo comparison, that an artifact would be like a magic item in Diablo or Path of Exile that has gem sockets?
Well, it's kind of similar, but it's also, the endpoint of it is similar to a D&D artifact. So every time you put a new modifier on it, stacking it on top, depending on how that process goes, you roll on the minor property table, which has negative, neutral, or positive effects, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe, because you're stacking more and more magic into an item, and if you're familiar with artifacts in D&D, which I'm sure everyone listening to this is, they have weird properties, right? And so that's where this comes in. So you roll a D100 to see what kind of effect, is generated there. And, it might be that your weapon now just glows dim light for 1 foot, which is kind of obnoxious, right? Because that's not enough light to be useful, but it's enough light to make stealthing harder. So that would be probably a negative property. It might be that your weapon, smells like daisies, which would just be a neutral property, doesn't do anything. But then there's also minor beneficial properties, like, it keeps you cool in hot weather, or it can always point north or something. So what that results in is both more powerful and more weird items, where, as you keep stacking these modifiers, you keep adding prefix or suffix modifiers, you get a more powerful item of your design, but you're also dealing with more and more of these kind of chaotic modifiers, which you can try to reforge, but that process is also, expensive and challenging. And these are kind of gated as you level, right? So you can't just do this all at level 1, but this kind of makes an item that grows with you as you improve. And kind of the thought of this is that, the artifacts we see in game, these super powerful, super legendary ++ items are basically, the end result of this process of some adventurer that went all the way to tier 4, upgrading the artifact over and over before dying as adventurers do and passing the item into the hands of a, treasure chest somewhere in a dungeon. So it's kind of like Artifacts, the origin story.
Oh, yeah. And I've often talked about how when it comes to certain magic items, they should be a story in and of themselves, because you look at enchanted items or the like in various mythologies, you don't have a bunch of +1 items in the same sense. You have this one thing that has its own history that does this very specific thing. Like, think of the whole invisibility helmet in the story of Perseus.
Yep. I mean, and so you can enchant those kind of properties onto the item. And another thing about the items that is worth bringing up in that kind of context is what's called significance. So for an item to be enchanted, it has to be a valuable item because magic has expensive tastes, So that's why a Crusader +3 sword, whatever, it has all these jewels on it because it needs to be worth a certain amount to hold enchantments. But there's also an alternative to that, and that's called the significance. And this is a much looser definition where, this is where we get into that sword that was handed down from 6 generations of your family, right?
Mm-hmm.
If a sword or, an item has a special significance to a character or plot, that carries its own weight in terms of magical ability to hold magical essence. So, it could be, the crown of a lost kingdom. It could be, a sword your character has used all campaigns. So it can be either personal to your character or to the world setting. So if an item has this special significance, it can be, it can be a good vessel for magic.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of encourages these artifacts, especially, to be forged out of, items that are relevant to characters and plots rather than just made for that purpose.
Oh yeah,
So if you do want to make it for that purpose, that's where the valuable comes in. You just kind of glue a bunch of gemstones to it.
Mm-hmm.
Make it gaudy. That's where the Rod of Rulership, whatever, comes from. The Rod of Wonders that has all these gems glued to it.
Oh yeah, and I could see a potential fake out where the weapon that looks really expensive is just kind of meh, but the weapon that's a bit more plain looking is the one that has the actual effects. Sort of like the whole which is the right cup in Last Crusade.
Well, these are certainly decisions you as players can make when you're using modular crafting based on what your available resources are. Because, one of the ways to make a valuable item also is just to have a really good crafter make it. Because a really good crafter's labor is worth a lot of gold. So you can make, a masterwork kind of item that just has a much higher DC to make. So it's like super well made, even if it's not ostentatious. But it's just kind of different. There's a bunch of different ways to reach that goal of being able to hold the magic, but you probably don't want to just grab a sword off a rack and start working off it.
Mm-hmm. I can certainly get that. Plus I know at my table I'd be high up on there and making weapons that are overpowered but unsafe to both players and enemies alike. If putting in say a crossbow that acts like a grenade launcher but also has the rules of grenade bouncing. So
well, friendly fire is always a danger with some things.
I believe one of the rules of combat is the only thing more accurate than incoming enemy fire is incoming friendly fire.
There's a spell I wrote a while ago. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but the way it works is it targets a 10-foot radius, and it deals 3d6 damage. So it's like a worse shatter, but for every 6 you roll, it expands the radius by 5 feet and rolls on the d6. So you can't, if it rolls 3d6, it goes from a 10-foot radius. If it rolls 3 6s, it goes to 15, 20, 25 feet. And suddenly doing 66 of damage. So it's one of those that has very likelihood of not blowing up exactly what you intended.
Yeah, I had an early artifact in some of my games that was basically the legally distinct version of the noisy cricket from Men in Black. Would do a lot of sonic damage, but every time you fire the thing, unless you properly brace yourself, you're going to be knocked back flying.
Yep. So I don't know how many more chaotic properties there will be. The existing modular crafting system is out there. It has a demo. It's on the Kickstarter update. One of the Kickstarter updates links to the demo. But, one of the things that is, in progress from the book is more and more of these modifiers to keep expanding this kind of, keep expanding the, roster of effects for more exotic things, more weird things. Because, it's a lot easier to make these modifiers and, kind of tune them in than, make an entire magic item. And then once you have that modifier, the player can use it in so many different ways with the modular system. So it's, I think so far it's come out with reasonably interesting but mostly balanced results. But it's the more modular system is, the more room for chaos there is. But it tries to make it so it doesn't get too crazy, but that it's not too much of a nanny system.
Oh yeah. I could certainly get that. Now, what are you shooting for as far as a release window?
So, the digital version is scheduled for November this year, which is a ways off, but there is already a playtest packet out as part of the Kickstarter that is, I think, 150 pages, and that is free for anyone to go get and look at. And it's linked on the Kickstarter page. So the fact that the book is going to be 250 pages and there's already a playtest packet of 150 pages should tell you that, there is a lot of stuff that is already done. And so that's kind of how that's going to work. As we're on the last 48 hours of the Kickstarter now, as I say this, but there will be late pledges enabled. So depending on when this goes up, you will still be able to get in on this. But the way it's going to work is, there's the 151 playtest packet playtest pack that already exists, and then every month until December, that will be refined into the actual book. The first couple months will be me making content to finish the contents already in there, meet the stretch goals, and to complete a few of the modules that aren't done yet, like the airship combat, all the airship upgrades, that kind of stuff. And then it'll go to the editors and artists to keep filling in all the art. Though I already have probably 50 to 100 pieces of art already done, but they'll have a good bit more still coming. So each month until November, it'll kind of go up and up and up until we get the final PDF version, and then it will go to printing. And printing will take a while. It estimates May of next year. That is a hopefully conservative estimate, but if anyone is tracking how long ago I was last on your channel to talk about the last book took over 2 years to finish. I think that will not be the case this time, but I want to build in enough time that I am pretty comfortable with the schedule. So I'm hoping that we will see it print by the end of the year. And then shipping is, a black box of which books eventually come out of. So I will hope that is first quarter next year, but fate tends to have weird twists and turns in that story.
Oh, yeah.
The last time I tried to ship a book, tariffs got announced. So, things can go unexpected directions.
Yeah, we will make sure to knock on wood.
Indeed.
Because
I have seen 2 shipping shocks in the shipping period of both my books. The first one shipping during COVID, and the second one shipping during the tariff apocalypse. So I am hopeful that the third one does not ship during the world implosion.
I'd hope so too. The world is where I keep all my stuff.
I've grown attached to it.
Yeah. But with that said, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come all the way to my monastery once again.
Thank you for having me on.
Yep, and anytime you see fit to return, the door is always open. As I often say around here, drinking is not mandatory, but it is encouraged.
Thank you.
And of course, a sincere thanks goes out as well to everyone who took the time out of their schedule to come onto the show and enjoy the madness. And there will be plenty more where that came from, as there always is here, on the open bar of the internet. But until then, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.